Oh, yes, it's being recorded, so I deny any responsibility for anything that comes out of my mouth. There's a ventriloquist in the corner, so if he swears there's something inappropriate, it's him, not me. There you go. Deny all responsibility. So, yeah, Jenny, crack on. First question.
Okay, right. So, first question. Given the ever-changing guidance around surrounding COVID-19, how can we best ensure structure for children who need it in their lives?
Yeah, great question. So I'll probably go off at a tangent already. Autistic children are resistant to change. That's what we're told, isn't it? I don't believe it's actually the case. So like with so many things we get told, it's like the first book I ever wrote, the first sentence is don't ever believe anything you read about autism, which I thought was quite a good opening to a book about autism. But it's true. Don't believe what you're told, unless it's me. I'm always right, of course. No, but we get told about autism theory, about diagnostic criteria, about what autism is, about definitions. Almost all of it is, how can I put it, is not entirely valid for all autistic children. I always say this to parents, please don't believe everything that you're told, because if it's generic about autistic children in general, then of course it's not going to apply to all autistic kids all of the time. And it may be completely the opposite for your own child. That's the nature of autism. In the same way you can't say anything generic about what I call the PNT, the predominant neurotype. And what's so special about the autistic population? They're not a homogenous group that are all the same, as you very well know. So, and I think, oh God, we are being recorded. Oh, who cares? Most theorists are wrong. Most academics, I think, are probably wrong. They're not rooted in practice. Anyway, anyway, yeah, don't really touch on that. But so this notion that autistic children and adults are resistant to change, you might be sitting there thinking, oh God, my child is really resistant to change. They're not. They're resistant to certain types of changes, which is a very, very different notion. So I really put forward the notion that there's an autistic resistance to change that is completely different conceptually to saying people just don't like change per se. So I can almost guarantee you in your child, I can't, but I suspect very strongly, and I've not met your kids, that there are all sorts of changes that go on in the lives of your kids that they're oblivious to. They couldn't care less. But there are some things that if they change even ever so slightly, then the shit hits the fan, proverbially, or really sometimes. So there must be a way of explaining that. And I think it all comes down to what I call I suppose it's a theory, but a theory of global stability. So most people are relatively stable most of the time, okay? So say, because people have got all sorts of things they can rely on for their own stability. So I was thinking of a ridiculous analogy. So say you've got, say you've got something really important to do tomorrow at 9 o'clock, okay? Like something really super important that you just, I don't know, you're getting married. I don't know, no, something more important than that. Anyway, whatever. And you're a really deep sleeper, and you always worry about getting woken up in the morning. So you set 9 alarm clocks to go off consecutively from 9 o'clock. I like things in threes, so 9 is a good number. If when you go to bed you realise that one of those alarm clocks is broken, you don't get stressed because you know there's another 8 left. So your kind of level of stability and calmness is still okay. One thing has changed, one alarm clock has gone, but you've got so many others to rely on, it's not a problem. Now imagine that your life is all based on one alarm clock. If anything changes in that alarm clock, like there's a slight difference to it, and you can't rely on it anymore, all of a sudden you're going to get massively, massively stressed. Now I think autistic kids, their lives are incredibly unreliable. There's so many things that autistic kids don't share with the rest of the world. So they don't share the same communication. Even kids with language, it's still a different form of communication. They don't share the same sociality. They don't share the same neurology. And if life is almost entirely based around one predominant neurology, everything is different to the autistic child, which means that an autistic child needs stability as much as everybody else. So what happens is they become extremely reliant on things that they believe are rock solid. So either things that they can really, really rely on happening, like a routine, for example, or time, or school being open, or if mum says this is going to happen, then it's definitely going to happen, or whatever it might be. So things that they tend to fall into two two sets, really. Either things that seem to remain the same every day, like the route to school or whatever it might be, or things that are totally in your control, child's control, and they tend to be routines. Now, if you actually follow your child around with a stopwatch over a 12-hour period and literally time how many things during the day can be totally relied on, it's a very, very small window, which means that if any of those things change, then it's absolutely devastating for the child. So we often say, oh, but it was trivial, it was nothing, it was minor. It was just one aspect of their routine that wasn't the same. What's the big deal? Why is my child throwing such a tantrum? And I think that we don't understand just how reliant children are on those things for their own, literally, emotional and mental well-being. So what I think is encourage global stability. So what can we do to make life far more stable and reliable for the autistic child, so that then subsequently things that do need to change, it's no longer a problem. It's a much, and we get taught, I suspect you get taught to do it the other way around. Oh, the world is not a reliable place, you can't rely on X, Y, and Z, so we've got to teach a child to be okay when things change. You're not okay when things change when they're important to you, so why should it be any different for the child? So I absolutely reject that notion of we've got to force the child into realizing this is just the way that life is and you've got to deal with it. If we are teaching children you've got to deal with it, then something is wrong in the first place. That's why I can't stand it when you go into school and they say, oh, your child is coping brilliantly. They shouldn't have to be coping in the first place. There's still something wrong if your child has to cope with something. So again, it's, I mean, a bit of a trigger warning here, but I think, and I've done plenty of work north of the border as well, so it's no different in Scotland. And this is horrible to say, but I genuinely think there's this underlying subconscious bias towards autistic people being second-class citizens. I really do. So everything is aimed at everybody else, and the autistic child comes second. And it's almost a case of, if you don't fit in with everybody else, you're in the wrong. And I totally reject that notion. There's nothing wrong with being autistic, nothing wrong with it at all. So I think we need to change everything around the autistic child to fit in with them, as opposed to trying to force the autistic child to fit in with everybody else. Partly because the latter will never work. You're not gonna win a battle of wills with your kid. Let's face it. You're not going to force your child into being a non-autistic child. That's never going to happen. All you'll end up with is a trauma child, or a child with trauma. It'd be the same way of forcing you into being somebody else all of the time. That would be, at the very least, cruel. And at the worst, that would lead to very severe psychiatric problems. And yet, this goes back to my notion about autistic children being second-class citizens. We don't seem to have a problem with trying to force the autistic child to be different. And I find it heartbreaking. It's like, why is nobody recognizing this for the hell that it actually can be for those. I'm going off at a tangent, but anyway, never mind. We might get to the second question at some point. So going back to the notion of stability, yes, life is incredibly unstable at the moment. So focus on what is in your control, what is in your child's control, and actually almost rely more heavily on the fact that autistic children like routine and they like predictability. So encourage that. Say, look, what are the things that we really can predict? What are the things that we really can rely on? And the more that you do that, the more balanced things become and the more globally stable the child is. So communication is a great one. Like, we talk nonsense a lot of the time. I don't want to pick on anybody. So forgive me in advance. This is just the tiniest little thing, and probably most people don't notice. But the lovely Jenny, and she is lovely, sent me and you, I guess, a wonderful warm invitation to this meeting. And I'm sure you all noticed that she put PIN number. That's direct repetition, tautology. Why put personal identification number? It makes no linguistic sense whatsoever. Now, if I'm an autistic child and I'm supposed to believe this person in authority who actually can't even talk properly, where does that lead? Sorry, Jenny, that's awful. Laura said that they change the website regularly. So what? Regularity doesn't mean anything. Regularly could be once every 5 years. Frequency, now that's far more important. Sorry, Laura. Oh, but even just in the last half an hour, there's a couple of examples of where if you're quite accurate in your understanding of language, all of a sudden you can only believe 10% of what people are saying. Now, if you don't know which 10% to believe, where does that leave you in terms of your stability? So if we say, okay, to our children, we recognise that we talk nonsense a lot of the time. Well, first of all, stop talking nonsense. I always think it's a good idea to reflect on what you're going to say before you say it, to try and reduce any level of ambiguity or clear as possible for the autistic child, or openly admit, say, look, I do say things that are nonsense. So let's operate on relying on a third party, which might be your visual schedule or whatever it might be, or it might be your iPad, or it might be I don't know, a TV schedule, whatever it might be, and take the onus of responsibility away from yourself, say this is what we're going to rely on, and make sure that is absolutely rock solid. You can't change the fact that the government changes rules left, right and centre, and schools are open and schools are closed, and whatever. What you can do is increase stability within the lives of the autistic child, and therefore they're going to be less stressed about what changes elsewhere. I told you we weren't going to get through all the questions. It's not my fault. It was a good question.
Definitely.